So one of the things that I wanted to bring forward, and were I being able to introduce the movies, and we could celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is important for all of us, just as citizens. Southeast Street, Mexico, we're citizens too. Anyway, I would have started all the way back with Mary Wollstonecraft, and she is almost like the philosophical mother of women's equal rights. And she was the mother of Mary Shelley, because she went to France during the French Revolution, and she stayed there. She wrote this wonderful piece. It's called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. And she followed that up with Vindication for the Rights of Women. And it followed in this whole egalitarian philosophy that the French Revolution was based on, supposedly. Sidetracked and bloody, as a lot of revolutions do. And so, anyway, that's what brought her to prominence. And she was a very brave woman. She was a very unconventional woman at the time. She had several love affairs. She had a daughter out of wedlock. And she finally did marry another very famous philosopher, William Godwin was his name, and he was revolutionary as well, very free thinker. And remember, this is at the end of the Enlightenment, and even though the rights of men, and I do say men, not human, but men, had really been solidified, the place of women in all of this was not. And a lot of free-thinking men were a little bit reluctant to put women on the same plane as them. Now, that wasn't the case with William Godwin. And so they eventually married. Now, it's funny though, they didn't live together. They were very independent people. They were married, but they maintained their own households. And they would get together, but they were very independent. Yeah, it is weird.
For that time period.
For that time.
It
is very progressive.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so when she got pregnant with her daughter, she already had one daughter. And she became pregnant with, who turned out to be Mary Shelley. She goes through a home birth with a midwife. And so the midwife sent for a male bona fide physician for the day. He just sort of butchered her. She, of course, got a severe infection, and that's how she died. And so her daughter Lena knew her, and the father, William Godwin, after Mary died, I don't remember whether he meant it to be a salacious type of revelation about his wife, or maybe more of a tribute to her independent spirit, but he wrote sort of a tell-all. He told the true story of Mary, her love affairs, her bouts of severe depression, her suicide attempts, all of these things, just laid right out there. Yeah. And so for a long time, her reputation was not, And so really, the, what do you call, second wave feminists rediscovered her, in the middle of the 20th century, and so sort of revived her reputation, and she has risen in esteem to be, considered the intellectual mother of the women's movement. So that's Mary Wollstonecraft. So we also follow that. Okay, we have lots of other things going on. So there was a struggle for freedom, ending slavery in Europe first happened, and also in America. In around 1840, they had an international conference which was addressing the slavery issue. Delegates came from all kinds of different countries and some from America. And one of those delegates was a female Quaker preacher. Her name was Lucretia Mott. And so she was an official delegate, as there were a number of women that were official delegates to this convention. Another person that went along with her husband, who was a delegate, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She wasn't an official delegate, her husband was, but when they got to the convention, this was the American delegation, they found out that none of the women were being allowed to participate. They were being separated into a different part of the convention hall, and they could observe, but they couldn't really actively participate. And so a lot of the men stood up for them, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband, and some other men, from not just from America, but and they protested and they refused to take their seats as well. But the good thing that came out of that was the idea that, we could have a whole gathering of people who, think alike, they're united in a cause. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, that's where they met. They discussed it, I think they discussed it on the boat ride home also, about having a women's right convention in America. Now, it took a while for that to get off the ground, and just to make a long story short, that was 1840. It didn't happen until 1848.
8 years later.
Right, and that was the convention at Seneca Falls. And Seneca Falls is in New York. People that were fighting for equal rights, women's rights, slave rights, they all came together in that place, including Frederick Douglass. He was the only black delegate there, and he was, I think, one of 38 men who signed this document that they put out. It was called the Declaration of Sentinels. And what happened is that Mrs. Stanton sort of did a riff on the Declaration of Independence. What she did was, she said, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause that compel them to such a course. So, what she did was paraphrase and sort of change the words of the Declaration of Independence. She goes on to enumerate, how women have been wronged or denied the rights, just like the Declaration of Independence did. Where they said, well, the king did this, the king did that.
So she wrote a Declaration of Independence
Yes.
for women to pretty much the male species.
Yeah, she did. And a lot of the delegates were reluctant, to put their name to this document, and to attest that, yes, we believe this too. Frederick Douglass, he was a marvelous speaker and orator, and he got, on the convention floor and really gave a very heartfelt, stirring speech. And because of that, whatever little resolutions they were passing did pass, and they got some momentum. So from there, they keep struggling. They had another big convention in 1850, 2 years later. Then they start getting these little groups together that are making their own, but the momentum is there.
Yeah.
So even though they're not one united movement, they do have bigger groups, smaller groups, and they would meet and come together at these different times, different conventions. So throughout the Civil War, the women's movement was really tied to the anti-slavery movement. They believed that once slavery was abolished, it would be equal rights for all.
Because equal rights for all man, and so when they're thinking man, they're thinking humankind as man.
Exactly.
Human. Okay.
But that didn't happen.
No, because then the freed, like you were saying earlier, the freed slaves got the right to vote before we, as women, not even just African American women, but women in general.
Exactly. Well, so they put their campaign aside, threw their support into passage of the 14th Amendment, which truly emancipated the slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation, and they put that aside to support it, believing that that would be equality for them as well. Later on, when the franchise was proposed for slaves, they expected that women would be included, but of course they weren't. And so Stanton and Susan B. Anthony said, no, let's just oppose it. Let's defeat this and let's get an amendment that includes us too. Well, that didn't happen, and it caused sort of a rift. There were a lot of women that were willing to be a little bit more patient. Let's wait, we'll get there eventually. Well, that was the 15th Amendment?
Yes.
Okay, so there's the 16th, the 17th,
So about 4 minutes later.
Yeah, finally, yes. And part of it was that they got spurred on by other movements that were happening throughout the world. So we also have this same movement that's going on in England. And I would say it would be that women's movement that really influenced our own movement and how to go about it. And that's what one of the films, Suffragette, will be about, the British movement. And then Iron Jawed Angels will be about the American in the early 19th century, or 20th century. And so they had the leaders of that were Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst. She had 4 daughters actually, but she split with the younger 2, Sylvia and Dell, I think, because they were more pacifist type of philosophy during World War I. That's where the split came. Emmeline, the mother, decided that it was their patriotic duty to sort of put aside, once again, the fight for women's rights and to throw the support to the war effort.
Yeah, support our men while they're away.
Exactly. And that's what they did. Her younger 2 daughters didn't agree with that. One of them went to France, where she had a lot more autonomy and freedom. The other one, Christabel, was more in agreement with her mother. But before World War I, they had become very militant. They were the ones that started having very physical interaction with authority in order to promote their cause. That included spitting at policemen, throwing rocks through windows, doing things that they knew would get them arrested. And their whole motto, I'm trying to look for it right now, was, their motto was deeds, not words. They felt like, okay, we've talked and talked and talked, it's getting us nowhere, we've got to have action, they've got to know we mean business. So they were arrested, and also some Americans went over because Alice Paul had heard one of the Pankhursts speak at a rally, and she became so inspired that she went to England, and she became a part of that whole militant movement. And a lot of times these women were arrested, and they would go on hunger strikes, and the force feeding wasn't with a spoon like you do with your baby. Come on, eat that. No, they put tubes down their nose and throat, and they would put like a porridge type of mixture, and they would force feed them that way. And it was very painful and brutal. And after the public saw these things, they did it on purpose. They took punishment because they wanted the attention for their cause.
So they can get their
message out. And that happened again when Alice Paul came back to America. Once again, she started on those tactics, along with a friend of hers who had been there. Her name is Lucy Burns. And so two women you will see portrayed in Iron Angels, along with other famous suffragists from America. And Alice Paul was very interesting. She became, the militant voice of the women's movement in America. She mounted a campaign, not of terror, okay, but of activism. So she organized, I think it was in 1913, they organized this March on Washington. Now that's the year after Woodrow Wilson had been elected. And so a huge march. She had people coming from every state and territory and from other countries, and they all marched this big pageant march parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, in Washington, D.C. And do you remember when, and I'm not a fan, but when AOC and the female congresspeople wore white? Okay, that's what they got that from this movement. They all wore white. It was a symbolic gesture. And so, yeah, they wore white as a solidarity type of thing. And so when I saw that right away, I knew, the statement they were making. Now, I knew that, but a lot of people didn't. White? Okay, what's that mean? But, yeah. And so that's sort of an homage to what these women did. And so anyway, they had this big thing. There were a lot of counter-protests. And, it didn't go off without a hitch, without them being challenged. Later on, she started really harassing Woodrow Wilson. She had women that were called silent sentinels. And they picketed the White House starting in 1917, and they continued throughout the war effort, and they would get arrested, but she didn't abandon it, even during the war. She felt so strongly that, we just can't give up, we have to keep doing it. Now, there were others, okay, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her name was Harriet, and she was a lot more reasonable. And so it was through people like her and some other leaders that finally, I would say, the militants, together with the more reasonable people, put in these efforts together, and World War I. Women really participated in World War I. They went into the factories. They did the jobs that the men no longer were there to do. They also became nurses and other things, to aid the war effort. And the women said, we proved ourselves up. We're not going back.
Just kind of like we did with World War II. We no longer wanted to be housewives after.
Right.
We wanted to keep the jobs that we had.
Like Rosie the Riveter.
Exactly.
Yeah, who's the symbol of World War II. Well, same thing happened in World War I. And so finally, Woodrow Wilson in 1918, he gave in and he said, I regard the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are now engaged. And so he finally conceded. And even though he wasn't against women's suffrage, he just said, can't you put it off? He didn't want to rock the boat, but he finally threw his weight behind it, then state by state. Well, first, of course, the Congress has to
create the bill.
It passed the amendment, and then it has to be ratified by the states. And so it passed in 1919, and it was ratified in 1920. And so that's how that happened. But I thought it was so important for us always to